Why don't you plus verb. This pattern is used to make friendly suggestions or give advice in a conversational tone. It often implies that the listener has not thought of the suggestion yet. 1. Why don't you take a break and relax? 2. Why don't you call her and apologize? 3. Why don't you join us for dinner? 4. Why don't you try a new hobby? 5. Why don't you ask for help if you're struggling? 6. Why don't you start exercising regularly? 7. Why don't you visit your grandparents this weekend? 8. Why don't you read a book instead of watching TV? 9. Why don't you invite him to the party? 10. Why don't you apply for that job? 11. Why don't you take the bus instead of driving? 12. Why don't you practice English every day? 13. Why don't you share your ideas with the team? 14. Why don't you write down your goals? 15. Why don't you go to bed earlier? 16. Why don't you travel during your vacation? 17. Why don't you talk to the teacher about your problem? 18. Why don't you try cooking a new recipe? 19. Why don't you spend more time with your family? 20. Why don't you plan a weekend trip? 21. Why don't you save some money each month? 22. Why don't you listen to podcasts to improve your skills? 23. Why don't you join an online course? 24. Why don't you take care of your health better? 25. Why don't you adopt a pet if you love animals? 26. Why don't you learn to play a musical instrument? 27. Why don't you clean your room today? 28. Why don't you try meditation for stress relief? 29. Why don't you surprise your friend on their birthday? 30. Why don't you speak up during meetings?